Hello, host Eric here, and I would like to answer Hami's question that he asked in the chat, which I didn't get a chance to ask, which was he asked me if I am a moral absolutist. The answer to that question is we can we can think of there being three different kinds of moral absolutism. So there's three different aspects to it. Let's say there's the idea that for any given event involving moral agency, that there is a single correct adjudication to the moral issue. And you can reach that adjudication of the moral issue through utilitarianism or through a binary framework of some sort. So utilitarianism is a principlist position, and it absolutely is absolutist, right? It says, yeah, every moral action has a moral calculus, and it's determined by utilitarianism, and when we evaluate at the end, we get an absolute answer. So when you are arguing that we should do something because it's in the best interest of the country, you're a moral absolutist. Well, I'm sorry, not if you say that. If you say, we should do something because overall it's going to benefit the most people, okay? It's going to take money from the rich and give it to the poor, for example. You are stating an absolutist, you're using a normative framework called utilitarianism to justify a policy assertion of sorts, or at least a position statement that you're affirming. So that's the alternative to absolutism is relativism, which says, well, whether or not this is the right course of action is going to be not contingent on any metric. It's going to be situational, and it'll be contextual, and it'll be particularist, as they say. Of course, the problem with that model, the relativist model and the particularist model, is those two models are both identical to completely arbitrary. If you don't have a means of determining why it is that something ought to be, and if it's not a standard that you're going to refer back to again, then you're not constraining yourself at all in your policy decision making. There's no constraint. It's whatever Hami thinks is best, or whatever Eric thinks is best, or whatever whoever thinks is best. So what a lot of people do is they make utilitarian claims for one thing. They'll make deontological claims for another, and they'll make sort of self-interest claims for a third. And in each case, they're thinking, here's a position I want to have happen, so here are some arguments in favor of it. But ultimately, what they're saying is, I don't believe in anything. I just believe that what I think is best, and I'll come up with arbitrary reasons for it as I need them, and hope those reasons are good enough. But it's not consistent with other things you might be advocating for. You might be advocating for other things and other reasons. Well, why should we prioritize this reason here, but not here? Well, the answer is, well, we got to look at the situation. Blah, 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 blah. What that means is there's no reason to it. It's just a sort of a holistic gut thing. But if that's the case, then it's arbitrary. And instead of being rule of law, we have rule of man, which is what we basically have right now. I mean, or some sort of hybrid. So in the United States, we're pretty good about the rule of law stuff overall, for some populations. And at the very least, there are fairly transparent mechanisms of justice that you can utilize to achieve justice, although they generally aren't utilized for that purpose. But it doesn't make it quite impossible, and it's more plausible to achieve justice through that mechanism than any other. The thing about a justice system, of course, is that it is built upon consistent application of certain principles that are the principles themselves that I want to attack, and yet those are the principles they're going to use to adjudicate the issue. So it's going to be a tricky one if I ever end up in court. The point is about moral absolutism. And the first question is, do I use a normative framework or no normative framework? The answer is, I do the civically responsible thing and have a normative framework and try to be consistent. Because otherwise, I'm advocating for arbitrary decision making by individuals whom I happen to like now. And it's very short-sighted because we want to eliminate arbitrary decision making because when the person you don't like, when the person you really think is awful is in power, you don't want that person to have arbitrary decision making power. You want them to adhere to certain principles. I mean, after all, the person in power might not be a utilitarian like you. Or, even worse, they might be a utilitarian, but measure different impacts. And then, not only do you have no claim to accuse them of moral absolutism or of immorality or any sort of high ground shit, because you tell, so it's a mushy mess. But he's using your framework, so you can't even argue against it by saying that's not a meaningful framework. You are just making arbitrary decisions, because that's the core of the problem, right? Now, if somebody like me gets elected who's a means-based thinker, so when you ask the question, am I a moral absolutist, the answer is yes, but note what this means. It doesn't mean whatever it is you think it means. Okay, if it means something different than what I'm about to say. The answer to the question is yes, insofar as I'm a means-based thinker and a means-based decision maker. So we know that there is a fair tool that can be used by all people. Nobody's denied access to it. All people can scrutinize the arguments, and it is argumentation, the only tool we ever use to resolve these sort of disputes. If we're not using argumentation, we're resorting to violence. So the problem that we have then is not one of lacking the tools to resolve these things correctly. It's not one of lacking the intelligence to resolve these things correctly. It's one of lacking the will to resolve these things correctly. And that means we have come to tolerate, even embrace, the flexibility of inconsistency within our own views, of not having to, of doing it backwards, of going for, here's my belief, now here's some arguments that support it, rather than, here's some arguments, okay, well, that's not my belief, that's not my belief, that's not my belief, which is the proper way to do it. So, what I'm saying to you about things that are morally absolute, there's a couple of grounds on which this occurs. One, we have to play fair. So that means if you want the truth to win, if you want what's best for things to win, we have to agree that the best way to attain that is through fair, honest, direct, and flow-driven argumentation, which means if you make an argument, it gets knocked over, we note that it's dead. We don't come back to it unless you got a rebuttal, right? You can prop back up if you want. But the point is, when we are talking about an issue, we are making arguments for the purpose of defending, defining, and establishing a distinction between two people's points. Now, we can use this process to do first, find out all the stuff we agree upon. We don't need to argue about that. We might need to argue about the reason why on something, but we might not. So if we want to make things easier, in general, as a general policy, if you want an algorithm for this, right? Here's a TE approach to debate. It's funny, I never thought about that. I should probably do a TE approach. So basically, when you approach something as an argument, understand first the different positions you could use to I mean, the different ways you could use that argument to argue different positions. So if I say, well, we should give everybody in the country has a right to affordable health care. Well, you know you don't want to use that word right, okay? Because if you use it, then you've unleashed positive rights. And when you've done that, you don't know what those positive rights might be. And so, for example, if positive rights like that exist, then, well, I mean, there's no... If you want to justify things that way, then other people get to justify things that way too. And that's the most important thing to remember. Okay? So, look, right now, the cops, for example, when somebody shoots somebody, they don't get arrested if it's a cop. And often they don't even get prosecuted, even though they murdered somebody. So, that's big news right now. It has an impact that people don't maybe think of right away. It makes it harder for cops to pull you over. Because, I'm going to say if I get pulled over, officer, I need to do a little information, please, for purposes of checking on equal protection under the law. How many other police officers have you personally given tickets? He's not going to answer the question, of course, right? And at that point you segue and you say, well, look, the reason I'm asking is because I want to make sure you retain your shield law protections. And right now you're trading on some pretty thin ground with the... you're responsible to uphold equal protection of the law, and if you're treating people differently, then you really aren't. You don't have any moral ground to pull me over. Now, you obviously have legal ground, and I'm happy to take the ticket because I would love to take this into court and see what the judge says about this. You'll probably get away with it, I guess, but I intend to do a little damage in the way. I'll go in there and fuck shit up a little bit, for sure. You'll hear a lot of stuff from me. I have a lot of papers in me. So, how many am I a moral absolutist? Well, I'm a moral absolutist in this way. If it's okay for you to justify your policy recommendations based on personal revelation, as Not Host Mark did earlier, which was amazing, shocking to hear, shocking. I didn't know. I had no idea anybody would ever make such a statement. Anyway, if you're gonna say that, then that means I get to say that too. That's what I'm a moral absolutist about. That we have to play fair. But playing fair is required. That if you get to use something like that in your argument chain, that I get to use it in my argument chain. After all, that's how we find out what happens when those kind of arguments are allowed to slide by as actual arguments. Because if that's an argument for you, then it's an argument for me too, and anything goes. Anything. I can justify absolutely anything. There's no constraining principle. None. It's whatever Hami predicts or whatever Not Host Mark has revealed to him by the heavens. Same stuff. Same fucking arguments. Different words. Your words are economic, his words are God. Same arguments. Same arguments. What are those arguments? Well, at the end of the day, it comes down to what I think. I know best, that's why. That's why we should have Christian law, because I know best. because I've had revelations about it. Okay, well, I've got revelations too. And they say the opposite thing. They say something different. Or they say, uh, you know, let's all jump on top of that guy. Who knows what they say, right? My revelations from God justify murder. They do with Islamists. Now, not host Mark would say, well, they don't with Christians, that's why Christianity is true and Islam is false. Well, fine, but I have no way of determining whose revelations are true and whose revelations are false. So if revelations are an acceptable warrant for things, then anybody can claim to reveal anything, have revealed to them anything, and there's no way of knowing. I mean, might as well go with mine. Right? Same thing with you, Hami, is with the moral absolutist thing. You're resisting the absolutism on the grounds that the absolutism is a position. The absolutism is not a position. It's discipline. It's intellectual discipline. Nothing more. And fairness. Intellectual discipline and fairness. So, that means it's absolutely more true that it's absolutely true that things should not be arbitrary. Put it that way. That a non-arbitrary decision is more likely to reflect wisdom than an arbitrary one. That we should take the idea of a rule of law, the civilizing impact of law, and the state itself. The whole point and benefit of the state is that it removes decision-making from individuals and puts it in protocols, ideally. Unfortunately, when we don't protect the protocols by applying the proper limiting mechanism, then the protocols have no limiting mechanism, and you get the sort of morass of unnecessary nonsense that you currently have in the status quo. We can all talk about things we think the federal government ought not spend money on, right? And you can talk additionally of things you think the federal government ought to spend money on. But the things you think the federal government ought not to spend money on are somebody else's things that they think the federal government ought to spend money on. And so you guys who are the spendy types, you can squabble back and forth about what you spend on and what not to spend on, and you compromise in some way. You've got some shit that, so okay, well, we got our health care plan passed, but we had to bomb a bunch more Middle Easterners. It's okay because we're not ascribing to any principles, except the fact that it feels to me like it's really important for healthcare. It's the only real principle there. The principle being that people deserve medical care when they're sick, I guess. But that does not necessitate massive centralized healthcare programs. It does not necessitate any sort of centralized healthcare programs. It might necessitate the dismantling of existing healthcare protocols that are interfering with free market's ability to solve. It might. I'm not saying it does. I'm saying there's no reason that because you admire the problem that we got to have a government response to it. There's no reason to assume that. And if you have to put any meaningful arguments forth regarding solvency. So, on that grounds, I'm saying you're absolutely wrong. And I'm saying that the moral absolute is to ascribe to this fair, just, and true mechanism of articulating which things are wise, which things are poor, and which things are unacceptable according to our conscience and our morals. So remember, Hami, most of the things that you might be advocating for that would contradict anything I would advocate for are things you wouldn't be willing to do yourself. You wouldn't actually go and carry the weapon and do the harm for the behavior yourself. You wouldn't do it if you had to. That guy didn't pay his taxes. Go beat him with this club. Would you do it? Because you're asking other people to do that. Lock them in cages, coerce money from them at gunpoint, stuff like that. Now you say taxes aren't stealing. Well, I'm not. Taxes are often stealing. Look, again, it's a means thing, okay? I do understand that some compromises are going to have to be made. You should be saying at this point, but then, Eric, isn't your thing arbitrary too? And my point is no, because it's got a system by which these things are determined. First, we adjudicate the issue of rights violations. What are the total net impacts of a proposed piece of legislation on rights violations? Second, to the extent those things are being justified, what are they being justified by? We establish the clear, actual, real reasons. Remember, if you know the position and are trying to defend it, then you're doing it backwards. You have to reach the position by arguing the alternatives first and then eliminating the bad ones. It's the only way that you can ever get to anywhere. It doesn't work any other way. It's not like, it's not an NI thing. It just isn't. It's an NE thing. And these truths are, all the other truths have plenty of dominion in the world, but where we know we need NETI more than anywhere is in politics. We've got to get rid of this tolerance of bad argumentation. You know what? I retract what I just said. Fucking Obama's in the ENTP. He didn't. But he too much success too early. He got lazy. He had too much affirmation, too much success. It became a career goal for him rather than an ideological goal, and that ruined him. It made it impossible for him to actually ascertain the truth. And, you know, he had to make so many compromises to get into office. That's one thing I will not do. I will not make compromises to get into office. I'm going to tell everybody exactly what it is I'm going to do. So am I a moral absolutist is the question I keep coming back to. I mean, we all are moral absolutists. Every last one of us. We all know where we can get away with some gray area fudging with the language, and we're at the end of the day, ooh, you really hurt that person, you fucked up, dude, you're going to jail or something like that. Right? We know where that line is. And we understand it not just from a jail perspective, not just from an outcome perspective. Nobody's going to defend something awful that happens right in front of them. We defend initiating awful things from a distance for reasons that seem like a good idea when we're advocating these things. But, again, go do some of that violence yourself first and see how you like it. If you like it, then I don't want to listen to you. But I think 100% sure what's going to actually happen is you'll be like, oh shit, is this what I've been advocating for? This is atrocious. It's soul damaging violences. I'm glad I have very little of it on my soul. Wounds you. Breaks you. I feel very fortunate. Yeah, I'm a moral absolutist. So is everybody else. Except in their political opinions, which is where they most need to be. The thing is, they need to be moral absolutists and means-driven policy decision makers. Therein lies the truth. We can know the means absolutely. It's not a specious process argument. I'm giving you a concrete adjudicating factor, adjudicating metric to determine the moral status of any given situation, putting it up against the rights-based framework. And I'm giving you a clear steps to follow if you want to break this. If you want to violate principle, I mean, frankly, it should be an emergency, because if there's time to come up with a non-rights violating principle, a non-rights violating solution, then why shouldn't we do that instead? So I don't understand what the problem is. Basically, you don't like what are apparently extremist views on my part, as you see, black and white views. But so far, I mean, this is really the first time I've sort of started to explain a little bit. I mean, I've explained before a little bit. My views are not whatever you think they are. They are incredibly sensible, pragmatic, principle respecting, individual respecting, rights respecting, outcome respecting, and ultimately deeply moral way to make decisions. That's it.